I'm George Galloway.
And I'm Adam Gary.
And together we are the History Boys, every single week bringing you an episode from a different perspective, sometimes two different perspectives, on great historical events, great historical personalities, the clash of ideas and events, which brought us to the place we are now. And as I always say, if you don't understand how we got here, you're never going to work out how we get out of the state we're in. This week, we're looking at the Philippines. It's not an area of expertise of mine, though in the 1980s, I did make several visits there under the dictatorship and just on the cusp of the overthrow of President Ferdinand Marcos. I did learn a thing or two, but my fellow history boy knows a thing or 2 million. And so it's over to you, Adam. Tell us, because we are looking, of course, always at the colonialist roots of the state that countries are in the global south, but also in the imperialist countries themselves. In this case, the Philippines was colonized more than once, more than twice. Tell us about that.
Well, 3 is the magic number, or the unfortunate number, to use a more specific term. First, there was Spain, the great Spanish Empire, the greatly brutal Spanish Empire that is most well known for colonizing what is now known as Latin America, but which also in Southeast Asia conquered the Philippine Islands. Then, of course, there was the United States. Then after that, a particularly brutal Japanese occupation. Then the United States again, but only briefly. Well, we'll get into that. And then the modern Republic of the Philippines as we kind of sort of know it today. I think for the purposes of this discussion, we should start in the year 1896, because this was the year that one of the great leaders of the Philippine national awakening, a scholar, a poet, a political warrior, one of the great minds in Philippine history, Jose Rizal, was executed by the Spanish colonial authorities in a firing squad, and a black and white photograph exists of this final moment where he uttered the words of Jesus Christ on the cross, "It is finished," before the mortal bullets flew into his head. Now, Rizal remains a figure of great national acclaim. He's a hero in the pantheon of great Filipino heroes, but it wasn't under his watch that the first Philippine Republic was declared. To get to that, we have to go to the other side of the world, albeit briefly, to a time when an American Navy ship called the Maine sunk off the coast of Cuba. If someone is wondering what on earth this has to do with the Philippines, well, that's what maritime colonial empires do. They make one event on one side of the world have a ricochet in areas that are otherwise totally non-related. So the Spanish island of Cuba, because like the Philippines, it was still part of Spain in the late 19th century, in the year 1898, an American ship called the Maine sunk off the coast of Cuba. Experts at the time thought, let's be cautious, it's probably some internal malfunction within the hull of the ship. But William Randolph Hearst, who was made famous, infamous in the Orson Welles film Citizen Kane, which, by the way, I recommend, he launched an avidly anti-Spanish campaign. Not that he was pro-Cuban, but he was saying America, as a young power that needs an empire, should kick out Spain, which was by then a far sicker man in terms of being an empire than the Ottoman Empire at this same time.
It's kind of widely held or felt that this was, the sinking of the Maine was entirely manufactured. That
Indeed.
It was a maritime accident made to look like a cause of war.
Absolutely, and William McKinley, who was the American president at the time, he didn't want to go to war with Spain. He was a traditional Republican before the Republicans we know today, where they thought, let's be business-minded, let's keep to ourselves, and let's not get involved in this empire thing. That all changed, though, after McKinley
Didn't
and
it?
Deering.
Didn't it just?
We're still living with these changes today. Some are living under them. But so a reluctant McKinley was dragged by his feet by what they called the yellow press, which means something different in the Philippines than it does in America, but both are distinctly negative. They were the expression of the day was "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." And so America went to war with Spain, and it was a very brief war. The Spanish were vanquished quite quickly. It was around this time that the Philippines declared its independence. They saw that Spain was losing on multiple fronts to the Americans, and a great hero, possibly the greatest ever Philippine hero, Emilio Aguinaldo, General Emilio Aguinaldo, on the 12th of June, 1898, declared the Philippines an independent republic. Our story would end there, but the Americans had something to say about that. They stepped in where the Spanish left off. They wouldn't let the Philippines have their independence, even though they declared it, and even though Spain was de facto out of the picture. What happened then was the Philippine-American War, because the Filipinos resisted a new colonizer. The lost one fell by the wayside, and they'd be damned if they got a new one, but damned in many ways they were. That war didn't last all too long. It ended in 1902, except for in Mindanao, in the south, where the Muslim Filipinos, the Moros, continued to fight and resist until 1913. And it was during this stage of the battle that some of the worst ever torture techniques that were later implemented in other wars were pioneered. General Pershing, who Donald Trump quite likes, is one of the men who oversaw a lot of this torture. Yet in 1913, this stage of the rebellion ended, and the Philippines officially became what was soon to be called the Insular Government, meaning an American colony.
So this war, was it largely maritime, Philippines' collection of islands, or did the US actually land significant number of soldiers?
Significant enough to inflict damage. Compared to the wars that we saw later, the numbers weren't all that great.
We're not talking Vietnam.
No, not at all. But where the Vietnamese in the 1950s, when they were fighting the French, and in the 60s and the 70s, when they were fighting the Americans, they had the most modern rifles that the Soviet Union could give them. The Filipinos in this era
were alone.
They were alone, totally alone. And it's frankly to the credit of the Moros that they were able to fight for so long, and that fighting spirit of the Moros is a theme that we're going to see throughout this discussion. But indeed, by 1913, all of the Philippines was subdued, and it was part of the American empire. So you can't...
They never called them, they still don't call themselves an empire, so how did they exercise their colonial control over the Philippines?
Well, in much the same way that France exercised its control over places like Algeria and what was then called Indochina, or what the British did to about a quarter of the world, etc. It was said by Gore Vidal, and we've mentioned this before, that the only original art form America invented was marketing. And in the American empire, we really get to see this. They never called it an empire, and to be fair, there were many members of the US Congress who said, what the hell are we doing? We're a nation out to make our own money, not to steal other people's money. But the confluence quickly led people to say, okay, let's embrace empire. It was managed from Washington, and it was at this time when many Filipinos started to come to the United States, long before the more famous wave of what is now called OFWs, Overseas Filipino Workers, in the 70s. There's a catch, though. In 1934, decades after the overtly racist Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, the US said, well, we're eventually going to give the Philippines independence, so we're going to make it that much harder for Filipino workers to come to the United States. There's always a catch in colonialism, always a catch.
So, did it have the same kind of status as Puerto Rico, or more informal than that?
In a way more informal, but compared to what, let's say, Puerto Rico is today, it was similar, but because times have moved on and Puerto Ricans can somewhat exercise their constitutional rights, things weren't quite as good in the Philippines, even though, to be fair, it was better than, let's say, when the Japanese were to come. That was true, absolute brutality.
This was perhaps the darkest night for the Philippines. What happened?
It was possibly the darkest night for all of Southeast Asia, certainly the darkest night for the Chinese and Northeast Asia. The Japanese formed a brutal empire in a very short expanse of time. And one of the rules with colonialism is the shorter a period of time in which an empire forms and asserts itself as an empire, the more dangerous it is. Europe and Western Eurasia saw this with the Hitler Reich of the 30s and 40s, and Southeast and Northeast Asia saw this with the rise of Tojo's Imperial Japan. The Philippine resistance should be saluted by the world. Their bravery is frequently in the textbooks a footnote under the American liberators who, while more heavily armed, because they could afford it, the Philippine resistance was remarkable in their ability to hold fast in the case of brutality, the likes of which, frankly, the world hadn't even known until that time.
So the US and the resistance throw off Japanese colonialism. What happens next?
Well, in that fight, that's one of the reasons, actually, why to this day, in spite of the brutality of the late 19th and early 20th century, many Filipinos to this day have fond memories of MacArthur and the Americans because they helped throw off the Japanese. And so here we see one of the interesting paradoxes where the same Filipinos who were bravely resisting the Americans several decades before in the 40s ended up rallying towards the Americans, mainly because the Japanese were that much worse.
Yeah. So the new era opens, nominal Philippines independence, but two great, as I recall them, Subic Naval Base and Clark Air Force Base, probably the biggest American military installations in the world at that time.
Yes.
So America has its forces in the Philippines and is still exercising its power from behind the throne in the Philippines, isn't it?
So much so that even when the Philippines became nominally, technically, and legally independent in 1946, America wouldn't even let them have their own Independence Day. By some stroke of wonderful marketing, the day that the Philippines was granted independence in 46 happened to be the 4th of July, when the real Philippine Independence Day is the 12th of June, 1898. And it was only decades later when the Philippine government said, no, we're going to celebrate the independence from the US, but our real declared independence wasn't on the 4th of July, it was on the 12th of June. So that was when independence happened, and the next great and controversial political figure to arise was the longest ever serving president of the modern Philippines, and that was Ferdinand Marcos, who first came to power in 65.
Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos,
yes,
famous
indeed.
for her wardrobe, her shoe collection. As I recall it, this was like Mobutu in the Congo, formerly Zaire. This was a period of massive looting of the Philippines' national wealth, I should say, by a ruling family, a ruling elite. Is that how you see it?
Yes and no. It's an incredibly controversial time, not just because of what was done and what wasn't done, but because of how the historical memory has been unobjectified. So let's start in the 1960s, when the Marcos government was actually seen generally universally as positive. The economy was doing very well compared to what the Americans were doing to Vietnam and later to Cambodia and Laos. Things were peaceful. The Philippines had one of the highest living standards in all of Southeast Asia. This was before Mahathir in Malaysia, long before a bit before Lee Kuan Yew really got going in Singapore, long before peace was brought to what was still referred to popularly as Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. It was more free than Suharto's Indonesia and politically more stable than Thailand. Things tended to change in the 1970s for both internal factors and external factors. The oil crisis of 1973 did not treat the Philippines well. The active participation, albeit not so great in terms of numbers, but in terms of prostration of the Marcos government to the US war on Vietnam, that was...
Clark and Subic were important to the U.S. war
They were
effort.
indispensable in many ways, and some Filipinos were actually sent to Vietnam, and that was just a horrific mistake. The spirit of ASEAN, which now both Vietnam and the Philippines are in, is all about non-aggression, but in those days it was very much a Cold War mentality which pitted Southeast Asian against Southeast Asian. We saw it internally last week in Indonesia. We saw it with the limited but still notable Filipino participation in America's Vietnam War. It was also at this time that the NPA, the New People's Army, a Maoist group, began a proper insurgency, and a similar one from Moro nationalists, upset with what many people outside of Luzon called the rule of Imperial Manila. It was in the 70s when many of the worst aspects of this period of Marcos, the martial law period, came to the fore. But not everything is as it seems, because as we see in the late 1980s, while many Filipinos wanted change in the 80s from what was happening under Marcos, just as they did in the Soviet Union, what people tend to find is that sometimes the change is worse than the situation they wanted to change.
It's portrayed as a turn to democracy. Aquino, the original leader, Aquino, assassinated at the airport on his return, his widow becoming the president. Even their son, I think, became the president, didn't he?
Indeed. This is the crux that all modern Philippine history has been defined by, and it's held historical memory captive. We live in an age now where the mainstream media, the mainstream schools, and the mainstream narrative in Philippine history has been dictated by the victors. The Aquinos were the victors in the 80s. This isn't to excuse any of the unpleasantries and the, frankly, subservient attitude to the US of the Marcos period, but when taken on the whole, the disaster of unstable governments, economic retardation, Filipinos having to force themselves into migration. There's an expression that a man who I think is one of the great Philippine intellects of today, Orion Perez, says, most countries export goods. The Philippines exports people. And while that trend began in the mid-70s, nothing in the Aquino period after 1986 reversed that. So I think the key to understanding the 70s and the transition into the 80s is to understand the following points. Was the Marcos government regime, we call it in the military period, in the martial law period, was it imperfect? Incredibly imperfect. But was in many ways the Aquino personality cult that much more crooked, that much more pro-oligarch, that much more tied into the CIA? Because we can't forget, while Marcos was under the thumb of the United States, Ninoy Aquino, who lived in exile in the US in the late 70s and the early 80s, had many high-level contacts with the CIA. This wasn't known in the Philippines at the time. It's known now for those who want to read what's been opened from the archives. And so where the revolution is portrayed as going from dictator to democrat, autocracy to an open society, the economy got worse.
Am I recalling this rightly? It was one of the earliest color revolutions. Yellow was their color, wasn't it?
Absolutely right. And everything that we now know about color revolutions, the most famous being the Arab Spring that turned out to be the ISIS winter, we really saw the template for this in the Philippines in the 1980s. And the most tragic element is that so so many Filipinos were let down. They wanted something better. They wanted to move on. And all they got, they traded one dynasty from another, only the economy got even worse, crime got even higher.
Neoliberalism, privatization, it was the cold bath for most Filipinos, wasn't it?
Absolutely, and the class of oligarchs that arose under this period were some of the most dingy and corrupt in the world.
So what happened next?
Well, the story that began with difficulty, whose middle period remains controversial, and whose most recent years were difficult, has for me what I think is not only a happy ending, but possibly one of the most inspiring stories in all of modern 21st century Asia. Even though we're the history boys and the show is the history boys, sometimes a leader comes along who's historic the moment he takes office. Such a leader was Rodrigo Duterte, who became president of the Philippines in, I was going to say 1916, no! He became president in 2016 after being the mayor of Davao in Mindanao for many years. He's the first ever president of the Philippines from Mindanao, the only one with a Muslim family background. He himself was raised a Catholic, walked away from the church after tragically being molested by an American-born priest. Interesting factoid there. And so he was unique for his background, but he was even more unique for his policies. One of the first statements he made when he became president was the following: "I am the president of a sovereign state that has long ceased to be a colony. I have no master but the Philippine people. Nobody but nobody." I think that's possibly one of the most important statements from any great Philippine nationalist since Rizal, because even though colonialism technically ended in 46, this colonial mentality in terms of geostrategy and foreign policy, in terms of economics, in terms of social policy, it remained tied into the colonial mentality, whether under Marcos, whether under the Yellows, who the liberals, the Yellows, we call them in the Philippine context. And Duterte turned all of this around. He went to Beijing and he said to Xi, "I want to work with you rather than against you." He turned to Donald Trump and he said, "Well, the Congress hates me. If we can develop a good relationship, that's great." He has good relations with Russia, historic, history-making relations, because the Philippines had very few relations with Russia previously, opening up to India, to Japan, making peace with Malaysia over old colonial relic territorial disputes in North Borneo. He's really been a man that's changed his country for the better, and he's a man that realized that fighting terrorism isn't only about fighting the man who says Allahu Akbar. It isn't only fighting the man with a foreign flag. It is about fighting the terror that is the plague of narcotics, which in the Philippine context means something very specific.
This has been, of course, the most controversial aspect of the Duterte period, and you remind us it's only actually 2 years, though it feels much longer.
Indeed.
He's basically declared a war on drugs like most of the world, but he's actually fighting a war on drugs. It's not just a paper declaration, is it?
It's a real war, and the war wasn't declared by Duterte. The war was declared by terrorist organizations who fund their mass murder, their head chopping, their arson with the sale of drugs. The war was declared by the people who, and I don't even know if I want to name the crimes, but the burning down of people's homes after you've tortured them, the raping of infants, and parts of towns where young women and even young men can't walk alone without facing disaster. A war was declared by the drug users, the drug dealers, and the drug traffickers long before anyone outside of Mindanao knew the name Rodrigo Duterte. Duterte has fought back, and what he said is, while my opponents clamor on about human rights, I care about human life, the most important human right, because without that, no other human right would be possible. And another rumor to quash while we're at it, His opponents, who have become increasingly hysterical, have inflated the numbers of those who have killed, who have been killed. They say it's 20,000, it's 4,000. They say that he gives shoot-to-kill orders. He specifically told law enforcement, only use a lethal weapon if your life or the life of a civilian is in danger. He's offered medical rehabilitation to all of those who have taken advantage of an amnesty, and instead of pouring money into corrupt policing and corrupt politicians who for decades were on the take from the narco industry, he's done something that the United States hasn't been able to achieve and offer a universal healthcare package to all Filipinos, which was signed very recently.
It's been a grueling 2 years, and one regularly hears reports that President Duterte may have had enough, that he may not complete his term, that he won't run for another term. And one of the problems with such a big figure, a big personality as him, is that there's not two Dutertes. It's not the kind of man who comes along 3, 4, 5 at a time.
Yes.
Is everything dependent on him? And if so, is he prepared to go on?
Well, Duterte is quite unique because while there are many ethical politicians and many austere politicians in terms of their personal life, I've never come across anyone as personally austere and sincere as Duterte. Lee Kuan Yew was a man from an intellectual background who was nevertheless austere, but Duterte is a man whose philosophy, which is an incredibly deep and wide philosophy, it comes from his experiences. Duterte's biggest challenge, which could also be his biggest success, is bringing constitutional reform to the country. Right now, there are parts of Manila that look as beautiful as Singapore, but the rest of the country is working for what Filipinos today call Imperial Manila. So is this a fourth colonial power? Previous to Duterte, you could say so. So he wants to federalize the country, while many of his most ardent supporters, both Filipinos and those who love the Philippines, want to see a transition from a chaotic American presidential style system that frankly makes the American system seem streamlined, and that's saying a lot in 2018. They want to shift to a Singapore or Malaysia style parliamentary system, which could be more based on one's merit than on one's connections to various oligarchs or to various yellow barons. And in this sense, there could be the next Duterte. In fact, there is one, and her name is Sara. She is right now the mayor of Davao, and she may well be the next Duterte, both literally and in other ways. Hopefully, though, as Prime Minister.
His daughter?
Yes.
And she's running and doing well in politics?
She's very popular as she stepped into her father's footsteps in Davao, and many people are saying in the near future she may well become a leading figure, whether under a presidential system or a possible parliamentary system. But many people are saying that she will. She's accompanied her father on some of his most important foreign trips. She's very clever. She's, if anything, even tougher than her father. So she's a woman to look out for. She can really hold her own.
Well, you've surprised me with that. But then the History Boys usually does. I've been George Galloway.
And I've been Adam Gary.
We have been the History Boys.